The quantum drive was leaking exotic matter at a rate that would have killed most organic life forms within 30 seconds of exposure. Ethan Cole stood 3 feet away from it, protected by nothing more than a salvaged radiation suit held together with thermal tape, and what his supervisor used to call aggressive optimism, and wondered not for the first time if he should have taken that accounting job his mother had suggested. The exotic matter, a substance that existed partially outside normal spacetime and looked like oil mixed with auroras, dripped onto the hangar floor of Outpost Tarith 9 and immediately evaporated into dimensions his instruments couldn't measure. His scanner was screaming warnings in 6 different languages, including one he was reasonably certain was just the device having an existential crisis. The ship itself was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were. It was approximately 40 meters long, curved and organic-looking despite being clearly technological, its hull the color of deep space with patterns that seemed to shift when Ethan wasn't looking directly at them. No identification markers, no registration codes, no indication of what species had built it or where it had come from. It had simply appeared on his proximity sensors 3 hours ago, limping on failing engines, and sent a distress signal in standard Galactic that translated roughly to "critical malfunction, please help before reality breaks." Ethan had been the only person on the outpost for 6 months. Tarith 9 was a refueling station positioned at the edge of charted space, servicing the occasional deep-range explorer or trade vessel that didn't want to pay the premium prices at the core systems. It was the kind of posting that attracted either people running from something or people who had given up on finding anything worth running toward. Ethan wasn't entirely sure which category he fell into. Possibly both. The ship's access ramp had opened automatically when he approached, which was either very trusting or very desperate. He'd climbed aboard with his toolkit, a collection of instruments that were technically rated for 16 different types of alien technology, but practically held together by luck and replacement parts he'd fabricated himself. The interior of the ship was as elegant as the exterior, all smooth curves and surfaces that seemed to glow with their own soft light. Everything was sized for someone tall, maybe 7 feet, with controls positioned higher than human ergonomics would suggest. And then he'd found her in what looked like the command chamber, standing beside a navigation console that was displaying error messages in a script he didn't recognize. She was tall, as he'd guessed from the ship's design, perhaps 6.5 feet, with a build that suggested both strength and grace. Her skin was pale with a faint iridescent quality, like pearl, and her hair was long and dark, almost black but with undertones of deep blue that caught the light when she moved. She wore robes that seemed to be made from fabric that couldn't decide on a single color, shifting between midnight blue and silver, and something that might have been purple or might have been a shade that didn't exist in human perception. But it was her eyes that had stopped him completely. They were large and almond-shaped, a violet so deep it was almost luminous, with pupils that weren't quite round, more like vertical ellipses that contracted and expanded as she looked at him. There was intelligence in those eyes and something else, exhaustion maybe, or loneliness, or both. "You are the station mechanic," she'd said, speaking standard Galactic with an accent that made it sound like music. Not a question, a statement. "That's me, Ethan Cole. I'm, the only one here actually. Station mechanic, station administrator, station janitor, station everything really." He'd held up his toolkit like it was proof of his credentials. "Your distress signal said something about critical malfunction and potential reality breakage, which frankly is above my pay grade, but I'll take a look." She'd studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You are not afraid?" "Oh, I'm terrified. But terrified is kind of the baseline state when you're maintaining a refueling station at the edge of nothing with equipment that's older than you are. You develop a tolerance." He gestured to the ship around them. "Besides, if your quantum drive actually breaches containment, fear won't help. I'll just stop existing across multiple timeline branches simultaneously, which honestly sounds like it would happen too fast to process. Something that might have been amusement flickered across her face, a practical philosophy. It's got me this far. He'd moved to examine the drive systems, pulling out a scanner that immediately started complaining about exotic matter contamination. So what happened? This kind of damage doesn't usually occur unless you've been pushing the drive way past recommended parameters, or you flew through something you really shouldn't have flown through. The second one. She'd followed him as he worked, maintaining a careful distance. There was a gravitational anomaly. My sensors detected it too late to avoid completely. Gravitational anomaly is a nice way of saying baby black hole or reality tear, or something equally fun. Ethan had traced the damage pathways, his scanner painting diagnostic overlays across his vision. The good news is your containment didn't fully breach. The bad news is it's leaking exotic matter. Your quantum stabilizers are completely fried, and your navigation system thinks it's in 3 different locations simultaneously. He'd paused. Also, I'm not sure this drive design is in any database I have access to. What species built this ship? It is custom, she'd said, which wasn't really an answer. Custom as in personally commissioned by someone with too much money, or custom as in technology that's not supposed to exist yet. The first one, again that flicker of something like amusement, you ask many questions. Occupational hazard. When you're working alone for months at a time, you develop conversational habits that probably seem odd to people who interact with others regularly. He'd started pulling damaged components, careful not to touch the exotic matter residue directly. I'm going to need about 6 hours to fabricate replacement stabilizers and reprogram your navigation system. The containment I can patch, but you'll need proper repairs at a real shipyard eventually. This is just enough to get you wherever you're going without leaving a trail of timeline fragments. 6 hours. She'd said it like she was testing the words. That is acceptable. You're welcome to wait in the station common area. It's not much. Just living quarters and a mess hall that hasn't seen actual fresh food in 8 months, but it's more comfortable than standing in a hangar bay watching me work. He'd glanced at her, then away, suddenly aware that he'd been alone long enough that his social skills had probably atrophied. Unless you need to supervise. Some people don't trust mechanics with their ships. I get it. What should I call you? She'd asked instead of answering. I said earlier Ethan Cole. And I am Sierra. Just Sierra. No family name, no title, no indication of origin, which meant she was either very private or very important, possibly both. Ethan had learned not to pry too deeply into the backgrounds of travelers passing through Tarath 9. People came to the edge of space for reasons, and those reasons were usually none of his business. Nice to meet you, Sierra. Try not to touch anything in the hangar that's glowing or making sounds. Those are either critical systems or they're about to explode, and honestly I'm not always sure which until it happens. She hadn't left. Instead, she'd found a place to sit on a cargo container positioned where she could watch him work, her posture perfect, her violet eyes tracking his every movement with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. Ethan had fallen into the familiar rhythm of repair work, diagnostic, disassembly, fabrication, testing. His hands knew what to do even when his brain wasn't entirely sure, muscle memory built from years of keeping impossible systems running through nothing but stubbornness and creative problem-solving. You are skilled, Sierra had observed after an hour of silence. I'm adequate. There's a difference. Ethan had been elbow-deep in the quantum stabilizer housing, rerouting power conduits around the damaged sections. Skilled mechanics work in proper shipyards with proper equipment and proper training. I'm just someone who's broken enough things to know how to fix them. That sounds like skill to me. That's generous. He'd pulled back from the housing, wiping exotic matter residue off his gloves. It came off easily, which was good because if it had bonded he'd have to throw away the whole suit. You travel alone. Yes. That's brave or lonely. Possibly both. You travel alone also. I don't travel. I stay in one place and fix things when they break, which is always. He'd moved to the fabrication unit he'd installed in the corner of the hangar, programming it to create replacement components based on his scans of the damaged ones. It's different, less brave, probably more lonely. Why do you stay here, on this outpost at the edge of nothing? The question was direct in a way that made Ethan pause. Most people didn't ask. Most people didn't care. Because sometimes the edge of nothing is exactly where you need to be. No expectations, no disappointments, just work and silence and the occasional ship that needs fixing. He'd started the fabrication process, watching as raw matter was restructured into complex components. What about you? Why are you traveling alone through gravitational anomalies? Because sometimes the center of everything is exactly where you cannot be. Ethan had looked at her then, really looked, and seen something in her expression that felt familiar. The weight of too many expectations, the exhaustion of performance, the desire for something simpler than whatever life had assigned her. That's fair, he'd said quietly. We're both running then, just in different directions. Perhaps we are both running toward the same thing. And what's that? A moment of honest simplicity in a galaxy that demands complicated performance. Ethan hadn't had an answer to that, so he just nodded and gone back to work, while Sierra watched from her cargo container perch, and the quantum drive slowly stopped leaking exotic matter across multiple dimensions. The fabricator had finished producing the replacement stabilizers around the 3-hour mark, which gave Ethan time to do something he rarely bothered with when he was alone: make actual food, instead of just consuming the nutrition paste that technically qualified as sustenance. The station's mess hall was small, designed for a crew of maybe 10 people during shifts when Tarith 9 had been more than just a forgotten outpost. Now it was just Ethan and too many empty chairs and a food synthesizer that worked about 60% of the time if he didn't ask it for anything complicated. Sierra had followed him when he'd suggested a break, moving through the station corridors with that same perfect posture that suggested either military training or aristocratic bearing. Possibly both. She'd looked around the mess hall with what might have been curiosity or might have been polite horror. Ethan's decorating sense extended to functional and occasionally, not actively depressing. I should warn you that the food synthesizer has opinions about what constitutes edible matter, Ethan had said, pulling up the menu interface. And those opinions don't always align with what humans, or probably what your species, would consider food. I've learned to work around its limitations. What do you recommend? Nothing on the official menu. But if you tell it you want water and then manually override the molecular composition protocols, you can trick it into making something that's almost coffee. And if you're really clever with the protein sequencing, you can get something that resembles bread. Together they constitute breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on your personal relationship with optimism. Sierra had actually smiled at that, a real smile that transformed her face from beautiful to something warmer. You have adapted to scarcity with creativity. That's one way to phrase, I've been outsmarting a malfunctioning food synthesizer for 6 months, because supply ships only come quarterly, and they keep forgetting I exist. He'd started the override sequence, coaxing the machine into producing something that smelled approximately like coffee and looked only slightly concerning. The first month I tried to follow proper protocols and ate nutrition paste for every meal. By month 2, I was having philosophical arguments with the station AI about whether existence without decent coffee was meaningful. By month 3, I'd learned to hack the synthesizer. The station has an AI. Technically, it's very old and mostly handles life support and proximity alerts. Sometimes it offers commentary on my life choices, but I've learned to ignore that part. He'd handed her a cup of the not-quite coffee. Fair warning, This tastes like someone tried to describe coffee to an alien who'd never experienced taste, and they did their best to recreate it from the description. Sierra had accepted the cup, holding it carefully, studying the dark liquid. You drink this regularly. It's this or admit defeat to a food synthesizer, and I've got pride issues. Ethan had taken a sip of his own cup, making the face he always made when the not-quite coffee hit his taste buds, resignation mixed with determination. See, barely traumatic. She'd laughed, actually laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the empty mess hall. Then she'd tried the coffee and her expression had cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been reluctant appreciation. This is actually not terrible. High praise. I'll put that on my resume. Makes coffee that's actually not terrible according to mysterious alien traveler. He'd started working on the bread override, letting the synthesizer think it was making a protein supplement but redirecting the molecular assembly. So what's the center of everything like, the place you can't be? Sierra had been quiet for a moment, running one finger around the rim of her cup. Suffocating, beautiful and necessary and suffocating, every word measured, every action observed, every moment part of a performance that cannot end, because too many people depend on it continuing. That sounds exhausting. It is the most exhausting thing I have ever done, and I have been doing it for decades. Ethan had glanced at her, trying to guess her age and failing completely. Alien physiology made that impossible. She could have been 30 or 300 for all he knew. Decades is a long time to perform. Some performances are expected to last a lifetime. That's depressing. The synthesizer had produced something that looked vaguely bread-like. He'd torn it in half and offered her a piece. Here, definitely not poison, probably nutritious. Maybe even tasty if you squint. Sierra had accepted it, examining it like it was a curious artifact. You share food very easily. It's synthetic matter rearranged by a malfunctioning machine. Not exactly precious. Besides, you're stuck here for 6 hours while I fix your ship. The least I can do is offer hospitality, even if that hospitality is questionable coffee and maybe bread. He'd taken a bite of his half. See, I'm eating it too. Solidarity in potential food poisoning. You are very strange, Ethan Cole. I get that a lot. Well, I used to get that a lot. Lately, I don't get much of anything because there's nobody here to tell me I'm strange. He'd settled into one of the empty chairs, gesturing for her to do the same. It's one of the benefits of isolation. Nobody around to judge your life choices or point out that talking to a food synthesizer isn't normal social behavior. Sierra had sat, her movements careful and deliberate. You do not seem like someone who belongs in isolation. I don't know what I seem like anymore. 6 months alone does things to your sense of self. He'd studied his not-quite coffee, watching the liquid swirl in patterns that definitely shouldn't occur in normal beverages. I used to work in a proper shipyard, core systems, big operation, hundreds of people. I was good at it too, fixing things, solving problems, making impossible repairs possible. But I wasn't good at the other parts. The politics, the networking, the performance of being a team member who cared about things beyond just the work. So you ran to the edge of nothing. So I ran to the edge of nothing, he'd agreed. Took a posting nobody else wanted and discovered that being alone is simultaneously the most peaceful and most lonely experience available to sentient beings. Some days I love it. Some days I stare at the walls and wonder what I'm doing with my life. Today was shaping up to be a wall-staring day until your ship showed up leaking exotic matter. I am glad my crisis provided you with purpose. Ethan had laughed, surprised by her dry humor. See, that's funny. You're funny. I wasn't expecting funny from someone who looks like they should be addressing a formal assembly about important galactic matters. Something had shifted in Sierra's expression, a flicker of something that might have been pain or recognition. Appearances can be misleading. Fair enough. I look like someone who should be living in an actual house on an actual planet with actual people. And instead I'm here having philosophical coffee with a mysterious traveler who won't tell me what species she is or where she's from. Would it matter if I told you? Probably not. I'm just curious by nature. Occupational hazard of being a mechanic. You want to know how things work, what they're made of, why they are the way they are. He'd finished his bread, which had been exactly as mediocre as expected. But I respect privacy. Everyone who comes through Tarath 9 has secrets. That's half the reason they come here. Nobody asks questions at the edge of nothing. You ask many questions. I ask the kind of questions that don't require real answers. There's a difference between being curious and being intrusive. I learned that distinction the hard way. He'd stood, collecting their empty cups. We should get back to work. Those stabilizers need to be installed and calibrated, and your navigation system isn't going to reprogram itself. Though honestly, with some of the AIs I've met, that's not impossible. Sierra had stood as well, and for a moment they'd been close enough that Ethan could see the faint patterns in her iridescent skin, like constellations mapped across pearl. "Thank you," she'd said quietly, "for the coffee and the bread and the conversation without performance. Anytime you're passing through the edge of nothing and need questionable beverages and someone to talk to, I'm usually here." He'd meant it as a joke, a throwaway comment, but something in her expression had suggested she'd taken it seriously. They'd returned to the hangar, and Ethan had fallen back into repair work while Sierra watched. But the silence felt different now, less like the presence of a stranger, and more like the comfortable quiet of two people who'd somehow become familiar despite knowing almost nothing real about each other. The navigation system had required complete reprogramming, which meant Ethan spent 2 hours interfacing directly with code that predated most current Galactic standard protocols. Sierra's ship was old, he'd realized, not in the sense of being poorly maintained, but in the sense of being built using technologies that shouldn't exist anymore or maybe hadn't been invented yet. The temporal mechanics alone made his head hurt. He'd asked her about it carefully, and she'd simply said custom again in that way that meant the conversation was over. By hour 5, the repairs were nearly complete. The quantum drive was contained and stable. The navigation system knew where it was, singular, not plural. The exotic matter had stopped leaking across dimensional boundaries. It was good work, maybe the best work Ethan had done in months, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of a problem solved, a system restored. It was also nearly time for Sierra to leave, and Ethan was discovering that 6 months of isolation hadn't quite eliminated his capacity to regret losing something he'd barely had. "You should test the drive before you attempt any long-distance travel," he'd said, running final diagnostics. "I'm confident in the repairs, but confident and certain are different things when you're dealing with quantum mechanics." "I will test it." Sierra had moved closer, looking at the readouts over his shoulder. She was tall enough that she didn't have to lean much to see his screen. "Your work is excellent, Ethan Cole." "It's adequate," he deflected automatically. "I just persuaded your systems to function within normal parameters instead of trying to exist in multiple states simultaneously. You understand that this ship is worth more than this entire outpost. I figured, given the custom technology and the fact that you're traveling alone in something this sophisticated, rich, important, or running from something really serious. Maybe all three." "All three," Sierra had confirmed quietly. Then, before Ethan could process that admission, "Have you ever wanted to leave, to abandon the edge of nothing and return to the center?" The question had made him pause, his hands stilling on the diagnostic controls. "Sometimes, usually late at night when the silence gets too heavy, and I remember what it was like to have conversations that lasted longer than 6 hours with someone passing through." He'd turned to face her properly. "But then I remember why I left, and the edge of nothing starts looking peaceful again. It's a cycle. What if the center of everything changed? What if it became a place where you could breathe instead of a place that suffocated you? That's a nice thought, but places don't change. People do, and people bring their complications with them wherever they go. Sierra had reached out then, her hand hovering near his face but not quite touching. May I tell you something true? You haven't been telling me true things. I have been telling you true things framed as hypothetical things. Now I would like to tell you an actual true thing without framing. Her violet eyes had been luminous in the hangar's lighting. My name is not Sierra. It is HFY-style, and I am the queen of the Velden supremacy, which controls 147 star systems and contains a population of approximately 16 billion souls. Ethan had stared at her. His brain had tried several responses, discarded all of them, and finally settled on, that seems like a lot of responsibility. It is an impossible amount of responsibility, which is why I occasionally take my personal vessel and fly to the edges of known space where nobody recognizes me and I can pretend to be simply Sierra, a traveler with a damaged ship. She'd lowered her hand. Until this time, when I flew through a gravitational anomaly and ended up here, being treated with kindness by someone who does not fear me or want anything from me except to fix my ship and share terrible coffee. The coffee isn't that terrible. Ethan, right? Processing. You're a queen of a star empire with billions of subjects, and you've been sitting in my hangar for 5 hours while I babbled about food synthesizers and my inadequate career choices. Yes. Did I at any point say something catastrophically inappropriate? Because I feel like I probably said something catastrophically inappropriate. That had made her smile again, genuine and warm. You treated me like a person instead of a political entity. It was the least catastrophically inappropriate interaction I have had in years. Ethan had needed to sit down. He'd found a nearby cargo container and lowered himself onto it, his mind racing through the past 5 hours, recontextualizing every conversation. This is why you can't be in the center of everything. Because when you're there, you're not a person, you're a performance. Exactly. Ashvira, he supposed he should think of her correctly now, had sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. And here at the edge of nothing, with a mechanic who asks questions but respects silence and shares his questionable coffee, I was just someone whose ship needed fixing. Do you understand how rare that is? How precious? I'm starting to. He'd looked at her, seeing her differently now but also exactly the same, still exhausted, still lonely, still running toward honest simplicity in a galaxy that demanded complicated performance. What happens now? You get back in your royal ship and return to your 147 star systems and 16 billion subjects, and I stay here fixing things at the edge of nothing. That is what should happen. That is what protocol and duty and centuries of tradition demand. But I find myself not wanting to leave. She turned to face him fully. I find myself wanting to stay in this small outpost with its malfunctioning food synthesizer and its mechanic who treats queens like people and makes coffee that is actually not terrible. I find myself imagining what it would be like to breathe without performance, even if just for a few more hours. Your people will be looking for you. Queens don't just disappear. My people believe I am on a diplomatic meditation retreat, which is code for leave me alone for a few days while I remember why I agreed to this impossible job. I have another 48 hours before anyone expects contact. Her expression had become intent, focused. I could stay. We could have more terrible coffee and more conversations without performance. We could exist at the edge of nothing together, even if temporarily. Ethan's heart had done something complicated in his chest. That's a really tempting offer. Then accept it. But then you'll leave anyway. In 48 hours or whenever you decide duty calls. And I'll still be here, except now the silence will feel heavier because I'll know what it's like to have your company. He'd stood, needing movement. I'm not sure I can handle that particular upgrade to my loneliness. Ashvira had stood as well, and suddenly she was close, close enough that he could see the exact shade of violet in her eyes, the faint silver in her dark hair. What if I promised it would not be temporary? You're a queen of a star empire. I'm a mechanic on a forgotten outpost. Those math problems don't solve themselves. Mathematics are not destiny. Her hand had come up again, and this time she'd touched his face, her palm cool against his cheek. I have spent decades performing the role I was born into. Perhaps it is time to perform a different role. Or perhaps to stop performing entirely and simply be. Simply being with a human mechanic isn't going to be popular with your subjects. I stopped making decisions based on popularity approximately 30 years ago. Now I make decisions based on survival, personal survival, not just political survival. Her thumb had brushed across his cheekbone. And I think you might be essential to that survival. Ethan Cole, who shares coffee and fixes impossible things and asks the right questions. I don't know what to say to that. Then say nothing. Simply consider the possibility that destiny sometimes arrives in the form of gravitational anomalies and damaged quantum drives and mechanics who treat you like you are more than your title. Ethan had wanted to argue, had wanted to point out all the logical reasons why this was impossible. But logic felt distant when she was this close, when she was looking at him like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking for decades. So instead of arguing, he'd kissed her, or she'd kissed him. The exact mechanics became irrelevant somewhere in the moment when careful diplomatic distance became impossible to maintain. She'd tasted like the not-quite coffee they'd shared, and her hands had been cool as they'd framed his face. And for someone who'd been performing for decades, she'd kissed him with the kind of desperate honesty that suggested she'd forgotten how to pretend. When they'd separated, Ashvira had been smiling that transformative smile. That was either the best decision or the worst decision I have made as queen. We could check the navigation system, see if it calculates the probability of future disaster. Or we could simply exist in this moment and accept that some risks are worth taking. She'd kissed him again, softer this time. Stay with me tonight. Let me have one more night of breathing without performance before I return to the center of everything. And then we discover whether queens can rewrite their own destinies, or whether destiny is stronger than desire. Ethan had looked at her, really looked at this woman who ruled star systems and carried impossible responsibility, and had somehow ended up in his hangar asking for one night of honest simplicity. One night, he'd agreed, and then we figure out if the mathematics can solve themselves after all. The night had lasted longer than either of them had intended. They'd talked until the station's artificial lighting cycled through dawn simulation, sharing stories that ranged from profound to absurd. Ashvira had told him about the impossible weight of making decisions that affected billions, about council meetings that lasted for days, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw only her crown and never her face. Ethan had told her about his family back on Earth, about the anxiety that had driven him away from crowds, about the strange peace he'd found in isolation even as it slowly consumed him. They'd fallen asleep in the mess hall, Ashvira's head on his shoulder, his hand in hers, and for a few hours the universe had contracted to just that small space where titles and duties and the weight of star empires couldn't reach. Morning had arrived anyway. "I need to leave," Ashvira had said, standing in the hangar bay beside her fully repaired ship. She changed back into her formal robes, and somehow the transformation made her seem both more regal and more distant. "My meditation retreat will end soon. There will be meetings, decisions, crises that require royal attention." "I know," Ethan had kept his voice steady despite the hollow feeling spreading through his chest. "You're a queen. You have responsibilities to billions of people. I get it." But she'd stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I meant what I said about rewriting destiny, about choosing personal survival alongside political survival." "Ashvira, let me finish." Her hands had found his, her grip surprisingly strong. I am going to return to the center of everything and face the complications of my position. I am going to attend meetings and make decisions and perform the role I was born into. But I am also going to make arrangements, political arrangements, personal arrangements, logistical arrangements that may take months to implement properly. Arrangements for what? For coming back, for you. She'd lifted one hand to his face, mirroring the gesture from the previous night. I am a queen, which means I have considerable power to reshape circumstances when properly motivated. And you, Ethan Cole, have provided unprecedented motivation. You can't just, queens don't just, he'd struggled for words. Your people will never accept a human mechanic from the edge of nothing. My people will accept what I tell them to accept. That is the benefit of absolute authority when wielded carefully. Her expression had softened. And you are not just a human mechanic from the edge of nothing. You are someone who fixed my ship, shared his terrible coffee, treated me like a person instead of a performance, and reminded me why I agreed to this impossible job in the first place. Those qualifications seem relevant. This is insane. Completely insane. Also necessary. She leaned forward, her forehead touching his. I am asking you to wait for me. To stay here at your outpost at the edge of nothing and continue fixing things while I navigate the political complexity of convincing a star empire that their queen deserves personal happiness alongside public duty. It will not be quick, it will not be simple, but if you can wait. How long? I don't know, months certainly, possibly longer. I will need to prepare the court, adjust expectations, create frameworks that allow for, she'd paused, seeming to search for words. For us, for whatever we might become if given the chance. Ethan had wanted to say no. Had wanted to point out that waiting months for a maybe with a queen was possibly the most impractical decision available to him. But he'd looked at her face, her actual face beneath the queenly performance, and seen the hope there, fragile and real. Okay, he'd said quietly. I'll wait. I'm good at waiting. It's basically my job description at this point. You are remarkable, Ethan Cole. I'm adequate, there's a difference. She'd kissed him then. There in the hangar bay with her ship humming behind them and the vast emptiness of space visible through the station's viewports. When she'd pulled back, her eyes had been bright with something that might have been tears. I'll come back for you. That is a promise from a queen, which makes it legally binding across 147 star systems. That's a lot of pressure on a relationship that's currently less than 24 hours old. Consider it motivation to be patient. They'd stood there for another few minutes, neither wanting to be the first to pull away, until finally duty had asserted itself and Ashvira had stepped back, straightening her robes with practiced precision. The queen replacing the person, the performance resuming. But before she'd boarded her ship, she'd looked back one more time. The coffee really was actually not terrible. High praise from a queen. The highest praise I have given in decades. Then she'd smiled, that transformative expression that made her seem impossibly alive, and disappeared into her ship. Ethan had watched from the hangar as the vessel lifted smoothly, its exotic engines creating patterns in space that his eyes couldn't quite process. It had hung there for a moment, suspended against the stars, and then it was gone, jumping to quantum speeds that left only distorted light in its wake. The silence had returned immediately, deeper than before, because now Ethan knew exactly what he was missing. 3 months had passed in that silence. 3 months of routine maintenance and terrible coffee and conversations with the station AI about whether waiting for a queen qualified as optimism or delusion. Supply ships had come and gone. Ethan had filed his reports, fixed the things that broke, and stared at walls on the days when loneliness felt heavier than solitude. He'd wondered if she'd forgotten, if the complications of Star Empire politics had consumed her promise, if she'd returned to the center of everything and remembered that mechanics from the edge of nothing didn't fit into royal destinies no matter how careful the arrangements. And then, On a Tuesday that had started like every other Tuesday, his proximity sensors had activated with a reading that made no sense. Not one ship, 17 ships, a fleet dropping out of quantum space in formation so precise it could only be military. The station AI had provided helpful commentary. That appears to be a Velden royal fleet. I was unaware you had been conducting high-level diplomatic negotiations. I wasn't conducting negotiations, Ethan had said, his heart doing complicated things. I was just fixing a ship. That must have been exceptional repair work to warrant a royal fleet. The lead vessel had been larger than the others, elegant and powerful, broadcasting a hailing frequency that Ethan's systems translated automatically. The voice had been familiar. Outpost Tareth 9. This is the Velden royal vessel Ashvaris requesting permission to dock. We have urgent business with station administrator Ethan Cole. Ethan had activated his response system, with hands that definitely weren't shaking. Permission granted, though I should mention that calling this an outpost is generous. It's mostly just me and a malfunctioning food synthesizer. The malfunctioning food synthesizer was mentioned in the briefing materials. It has become somewhat legendary. He'd met her at the airlock, because of course it had been her. Who else would arrive with an entire royal fleet? Ashvira had emerged wearing formal ceremonial robes that looked like they cost more than his entire station, surrounded by guards who carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy and advisors who looked varying degrees of concern. But she'd looked at him, just him, and smiled. I told you I would come back. You did. I was maybe 60% sure you meant it. Only 60%. She'd stepped forward, ignoring the scandalized expressions of her advisors. I promised. Queens do not break promises. Your fleet seems excessive for a social visit. This is not a social visit. She'd taken his hands right there in front of her entire retinue. This is a formal diplomatic mission with significant political implications and extremely complicated legal documentation that my advisors have prepared over the past 3 months. One of the advisors, an elderly Velden with silver hair and an expression of profound resignation, had stepped forward with a data tablet. Administrator Cole, we have prepared a comprehensive briefing on the political, social, and practical implications of a formal bond between a Velden queen and a human citizen. The documentation is approximately 4,000 pages and covers everything from succession protocols to cultural integration frameworks. Ethan had stared at the tablet. That's thorough. We are very good at our jobs, even when those jobs involve facilitating unprecedented romantic relationships that violate centuries of tradition. The advisor had somehow made this sound both professional and deeply exhausted. Her Majesty has been extremely insistent. I rewrote 17 different legal codes and personally negotiated with approximately 40 different political factions, Ashvira had said proudly. It was the most engaged I have been in governance in decades. Apparently having personal motivation makes one significantly more effective at political maneuvering. So what are you asking exactly? I am asking if you would be willing to leave your outpost at the edge of nothing and come with me to the center of everything, not as a performance, as yourself, as someone who fixes impossible things and makes terrible coffee and reminds me that queens are people too. She'd squeezed his hands. The political framework is established. The legal documentation is complete. My advisors have contingency plans for every possible complication. All that remains is your answer. Ethan had looked at her, this impossible woman who ruled star systems and had spent 3 months reshaping political reality because he'd fixed her ship and shared synthetic coffee. What about my job, the station? We're assigning a replacement administrator. Also upgrading all your equipment because apparently your food synthesizer has been filing complaints about inadequate maintenance for 6 months. It can file complaints. Apparently, your station AI copied me on the reports. They were quite detailed. She'd moved closer, her forehead touching his like it had in the hangar 3 months ago. "Come with me, Ethan Cole. Come be inadequate in the center of everything instead of alone at the edge of nothing. Help me remember how to breathe between performances. Fix my impossible problems with your creative approaches and your stubborn optimism." That's a lot of responsibility. Considerably less than ruling 147 star systems. I have faith in your adequacy. Ethan had looked at her, at the fleet waiting behind her, at the advisors with their 4,000-page briefings and contingency plans. He'd thought about 3 months of waiting and terrible coffee and silence that had felt heavier because he'd known exactly what he was missing. "Okay," he'd said, "but I'm bringing my toolkit. Queens probably have things that need fixing." Queens definitely have things that need fixing. Ashvira had kissed him then, right there in front of her royal fleet and scandalized advisors, and the universe that had tried very hard to keep them apart. Starting with outdated traditions about who queens are allowed to love. The advisors had made various sounds of diplomatic distress. The guards had maintained professional neutrality. The station AI had offered commentary about how this was the most interesting thing that had happened at Outpost Tarith 9 in recorded history. And Ethan, who had spent 6 months alone at the edge of nothing, found himself at the center of everything with a queen who'd promised to come back and meant it. Sometimes destiny arrived in the form of damaged quantum drives and gravitational